So first up we have Dr. Huhana Hickey. She is Ngāti Tahinga, Waikato and Ngāti Ira Whakatohia. Dr. Hickey is an academic and disability rights lawyer. She has multiple sclerosis, was the first openly disabled Housing New Zealand board member, and is an unflinching advocate for whānau hoa and all disabled people. Dr. Hickey is a member of the New Zealand Human Rights Review Tribunal, director on the Odyssey House Board, holds multiple advisory and consultancy roles, and became a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit in 2015 for services to people with disabilities. Following Huhana, we have Dr. Debbie Hager. She's worked for over 20 years at the intersection of family and sexual violence and disability, disability caused by violence, and violence against disabled women. She is a member of several advisory groups, ensuring that disabled people are included in all government policies and processes to prevent and respond to violence and abuse. Debbie is currently working with VisAble, a disabled person-led organisation that is developing multi-agency responses for tangata whaikaha and disabled people experiencing violence, abuse and neglect, and working to build capacity in the sexual violence, family violence and disability sectors. Welcome, Debbie. Following Debbie, we have Hong-Jae Park. Dr. Hong-Jae Park is a senior lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University. He has travelled a long way to be with us today. With a rich background spanning South Korea, New Zealand and Australia, his research focuses on intergenerational sustainability, social lifespan and legacy, and migration, with particular emphasis on the concept of filial piety in migrant communities. Dr. Park's work, including his recent book, Enduring Filiality in Anomic Abuse, contributes to understanding the complex dynamics of ageing in multicultural contexts. And last but definitely not least, we have Sandra Dickson. Sandra is a Pākehā autistic gender non-conforming researcher and community development practitioner with 30 years experience in family and sexual violence. In 2016, Sandra founded Hohou Te Rongo Kahukura, a community organisation focused on building takatapui and rainbow communities without all forms of violence. Over the last 3 years, Hohou Te Rongo Kahukura has led community engagement research into the needs of older takatapui and rainbow people, with a specific focus on identifying elder abuse risk and protective factors. So, an amazing panel we have before us. Kia ora. Okay, we're going to move on to Debbie. Debbie?
Thank you. I've got some slides. Oh, I do that. The other direction. So I'd just like to introduce myself as a person who is now at the intersection of disability and old age. So I feel particularly interested in talking at this intersection. What I'd like to do is talk about the similarities between the abuse of older people and the abuse of disabled people. And we were talking at our table before about how we silo things. Thank you. I'm pressing the big one. This is typical of me and technology. About how we silo things. So really critically important, I think, to understand the similarities and why certain kinds of people have higher prevalences of abuse. So disabled people, as I'm sure Huhana will say, have very high prevalence of violence and abuse across their lifespans, from children right through to old age. And when we look at what family and sexual violence and also sort of state violence and institutional violence is about, it's about the isms. It's about ageism, ableism, but also colonisation. It's about racism. And when we look at these things that create othering, gender inequity, what we see is that at each intersection of these, the amount of abuse that people experience increases. So as people go through these, as people kind of gather these intersectional, disempowering relationships, more abuse occurs. So just using Claire Murphy's diagram here, I don't know why I'm so nervous. I know half of you and I like you, and thank you. So what I want to say is really well defined here by Claire's diagram, that those who are at the top of the hierarchy, who are hegemonic, who are white, able-bodied, heterosexual, nominally Christian men, experience the least violence. That as we drop down from that, we talk about women, we talk about children, we talk about older people, disabled people, Māori, Pacifica, people who are non-white, people who don't hold that sort of, people who are not nominally or otherwise Christian, we see intersectional layers of risk and layers of harm that are occurring. And so that's one of the real similarities between people who are in older age and disabled people, is that the rates of violence against men in those situations are significantly higher than the rates of violence for men not in that situation. And the rates for women are higher still. So we still have a gender disparity there, but significantly higher rates of violence against men. The next intersection is if you look at who harms disabled people and older people. So we have all the people who are acknowledged in the Family Violence Act. So that's the whole wider family, intimate partners, parents, children, older children, aunties, uncles, siblings, all of those people. In the family violence legislation now we have carers, so that's a similarity of people who are in paid or unpaid caregiving roles and support roles who harm older people and disabled people, but also the whole range of people who come into contact with people because people might require care and support. So health professionals, people in social services, people who are drivers, everywhere that people come into contact with people, landlords, employers, employees, have the opportunity and may abuse disabled people and may abuse elderly people, me. Also, what we see there, incidentally, is who abuses children. What we see in that list is who abuses people who are perceived to have less power. And that's older people and disabled people. The next similarities that I want to point out is the kind of violence that people experience. So we understand the sort of violence that's discussed in intimate partner violence, physical violence, sexual violence, psychological abuse, financial violence. These are all the same sorts of things that can happen to disabled people, that happen to older people. But there's a number of other things that happen. There's significantly more financial abuse. And part of that financial abuse is abuse of substituted decision-making. So we have a whole lot of legislation in this country that allows someone to take decision-making away from someone and give it to somebody else. It's meant to be in their best interest. It isn't always. Somebody, selling their parents' house, somebody misusing someone's money to pay for their own things. All of those ways that financial abuse can occur, and that abuse of substituted decision-making, which means that if a person is being completely neglected, and somebody else has decision-making power for them, we have very little right as institutions, organisations, people who want to intervene in that neglect and abuse to actually go in, because there's another person making decisions. And it's really hard to undo those situations. active neglect, so just leaving somebody in sanitary situations where they're wet, where they're not helped to the toilet, where they're in nappies, somebody who is malnourished because they're not helped to eat or not enabled to eat properly, somebody who's not clean, isolating people by not allowing them out of the house, by locking them in, or by preventing them using their mobility aids, by preventing them using communication aids. These are all things that are similar between older people and disabled people who are becoming older, who have experienced this all the way through. And abuse of people's human rights. So just substituted decision making, not letting people make decisions for themselves, be autonomous, do the things they want to do, live where they want to live. All of these things are things that are similarities across these two groups. And all of the sort of institutional abuse that goes on with restraint, with exclusion, with those different things. And I think the research is really interesting. You know, like, nobody is doing research around elderly people, disabled people in residential situations because it's too hard. So we actually have no measure of what's happening there. That's actually abuse of people's human rights. And then there's all the, you know, there's all the overt over-medicating people or under-medicating people, those things that you can do when people have health needs that you can choose to meet or not meet. So there's a whole lot of ways that disabled people through their lifetime are abused and that elderly people are abused. Recognising also, of course, that for elderly people that abuse might have gone on as intimate partner violence, but now we call it elder abuse or whatever. It's the same abuse through the life thing that I've forgotten the word for. So that's what I just wanted to talk about. And I think just when we talk to disabled people in particular, I want to say, disabled people do not accept. Disabled people do talk about abuse. They actively talk about abuse, neglect, harm, and violence against themselves, and active exclusion and marginalisation. And that, I think, also explains a lot of the ways that we treat disabled people. And we do not accept carer stress as an excuse. We might accept that carers need support and that they are also people who may be at risk because they've cared for someone for a long time, and they may be in need of care and support, but that is not an excuse for violence against anyone. Thank you.
Hong-Jae, I think we're just going to go and see if we can now bring up Huhana and have a second crack at getting the audio right. Fingers crossed. Welcome, Huhana.
Kia ora, I hope you can all hear me now. Ka pai? Okay, before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the passing of Kingi Tuheitia and the whānau of the Kingitanga, in that it is a very sad time indeed for our whānau. My hapu are out there helping in the background, and my in-laws are out there being part of that as well. So as we remember that, as one passes, others come forward. Kia ora koutou. Ko wakato mā Ngāti Era, me Ngāti Whakatohea nā iwi, ko Ngāti Tahinga te hapu, ko Wereroa te marae, ko Kareo te maunga, ko Whangoroa te moana. On my Aboriginal side, our family name is Namalak, skin name is Nurak from Gumbaranya, and our mob are Malak Malak and Gunbaranya. I'm Sami and also Navajo. That's me. I'm also an old Indigenous disabled wahine, and I think I can give you a little bit of lived experience as well as some background to this topic. When we're discussing inequalities, ageing, abuse and violence through an inclusive and intersectional lens, it requires a deep understanding of those inequalities and intersecting identities that shape the lives of older adults. including the specific experiences of Indigenous peoples. This approach emphasises how social identities such as race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, disability, cultural background, and indigeneity intersect to create unique experiences of ageing, and how these intersections influence exposure to abuse and violence. And here's a way to frame that discussion. I remember doing my PhD, and Maria Burrell, who's since passed on, was a Canadian academic, a disabled Indigenous woman, and she spoke of not just marginalisation, because you're not automatically marginalised for being a woman or for being just disabled or being Indigenous. You are marginalised for those sometimes, but often it's not as intense as to when you're facing multiple marginalisation. And when it deals with you're a wahine, you're disabled, you're Indigenous, you're a mother, you're a senior, and you live within poverty lines, that compounds. And this is where the problem's lying. And if we look at what's happening at the moment, I've discovered a lot of over 65s, a lot of disabled turning 65 and over have lost their care packages with no replacement at all for any of them. And what's happening is we're basically finding seniors now having to pay full price for wheelchairs, medical equipment, caregiving. They don't get any carer supports. You've got to go through the over 65s, and it's causing inequalities and marginalisation. So we have to recognise inequalities in ageing. Intersectional identities. It's one thing to talk about ageing. It's like talking about youth. But when you do that, you homogenise. And we're not an homogenised unit. As human beings, we are diverse. We are as diverse as anybody can come, no matter what age group you are. Millennials are just as diverse as boomers, Gen Xs, Gen Zs, and whatever else they're going to call us. It all exists. But when you age, those are compounded because of all the inequalities, disparities, discrimination you face constantly when you're younger. So older adults navigate multiple intersecting identities that profoundly shape their experiences. For example, an older Indigenous woman who's disabled may face compounded forms of discrimination and barriers that differ significantly from those experienced by an older non-Indigenous man or even an older non-Indigenous woman. The intersection of race, gender and indigeneity often exacerbates the vulnerability of abuse and marginalisation. Historical structural inequalities acknowledge the historical systemic inequalities such as colonisation, racism, sexism, ableism, classism, every ism you can find that disproportionately affect older Indigenous adults. These inequalities impact access to essential resources, and as you know, we've got cuts happening at the moment. So for disabled, our resources have been removed from us and are creating some very serious hardships. But with a eugenics government, we don't have to worry. We have David Seymour offering to extend euthanasia to disabled. So if we can't get housing, we'll just do what they're doing in Canada, asking for euthanasia. If we can't get our care packages, we can just be euthanized. That's the value that's placed on us, especially as we age. You've got the historical and structural inequalities, the things that have been with us all this time that was an attempt to fix a couple of years ago that's now all gone. Whaikaha, the ministry, is no longer what it was, and it was just new. Te aka whai ora is gone. Te whatu ora is going. What does that mean? When you're older, you're disabled, you've got a lot of medical interventions and needs. For instance, last year it took 2 weeks to get a procedure done so I could leave the house again. This year it took 10 weeks, and I only just got it done, but now I'm loaded with infections as a result. This is what happens when we don't look after our structures that care for our communities, that keep us well. If we're not cared for in the primary level of care, in the tertiary level, it becomes extremely expensive. When it becomes expensive, resources become scarce. When resources become scarce, they look at who to blame. And it's now us. I'm the cusp end of boomers. I've never owned a home, have nothing. But I'm one of those that has now become a cost to the state. And therefore, I know that as I get older, the risk of trying to live with dignity gets less, and just trying to survive becomes more important. We have the cultural, social constructs, hugely important, taken away at the moment from our disabled and our elderly disabled. Our seniors are starting to experience that. There's diverse forms of abuse. It's not just physical abuse, it's financial abuse, as Debbie laid a lot of that out before. And that happens a lot more as you start getting older, you start becoming more at risk, you start relying on people who may manipulate and rip you off, basically. Caregiving is an at-risk group. If you are vulnerable, I hate that word, but if you've got a caregiver that's going to bully you and you have got nobody around looking out for you, you're more at risk as you get older. Or in my case, as I become more progressively disabled, less able to utilise my voice, I will become more of a high risk. We need to create inclusive interventions. I won't carry through with the rest, but we need policy and practice implications. We need intersectional training and awareness. I'm sure you all know this. We, of course, need the research data on inequalities, which we have and we know. But if it's ignored by the decision makers, then it's just, it's just a constant ongoing battle. Intersectional research focus, engaging Indigenous voices. One of the disability groups, Access Matters, has been running a whole bunch of workshops, but they forgot to include Māori. And you can't do that when we're dealing with population, not just with Māori, but I'm noticing an increase in the health needs of senior Asian populations and other groups. If we're not going to embrace a approach that meets the needs of groups that are not merely Western in their lifestyle and their outlook on health and life, then we are doing a disservice to the multiple identities that exist in this country, not just Māori. But in summary, senior disabled Indigenous women are getting a raw deal now. They'll get a raw deal in the next 2 years, and I am hesitant and nervous about what our future will hold. But we're here to discuss a lot of that, how to reduce, and I'm hoping we can find some way forward from that. And I look forward to hearing everyone's responses. Thank you.
Hong-Jae Park. I'm Korean, New Zealand, now Australian too. Sometimes I forgot who I am, so don't worry about me. And I was a student of Dr. Bonus Scofield, Hannah's friend in Wellington. And I was also supervised by Jim Engelum, who is a Maori scholar at Canterbury University. Now I'm working at Western Sydney University in Sydney. And why I moved to Sydney, maybe you want to ask, because I didn't betray New Zealand, simply because I have a daughter, just only one daughter, always problematic anyway for me. For us, she couldn't find any boyfriend in Auckland, because you can imagine if she met a boy accidentally in Domain Park, next morning I will know who is the boy's name, because small, very small community in Korea. So we decided to move to a little bit bigger city, which is Sydney. Unfortunately, she is still single anyway. So. I have no idea. Following Debbie and Huhana's discussion about intersectionality of disability and elder abuse, I'm going to talk about similar issues, intersectionality of later life migration and elder abuse and elder care. The the main focus of my presentation is to identify a form, invisible form of elder mistreatment or abuse, you can say, in the migrant communities, not only in New Zealand but also all other countries, because we don't know yet about this form of injustice and inequality for all the migrants. So I want to highlight this kind of form of inequality among all the migrants still existing in our community around there. That's my main focus. Identifying the problem of inequality is just my responsibility. What can we do from here? That's the team's responsibility and all other researchers' responsibility. So based on this conceptualization, we need to understand how some of all the migrants experience this form of inequality in their everyday lives. I put a lot of wording here because I thought I couldn't have just 2 minutes to speak because everyone wants to talk. So, but obviously you can see my slides here and see what economic abuse means. Don't be bothered by the term economic abuse only, but the term actually I made up because the term actually is very strong to present what I want to highlight. But obviously we are talking about financial exploitation against aged parents coming to New Zealand for their children, and neglect, emotional abuse particularly, and also we need to highlight here lack of community oversight, because when you are living in another country, you don't have many, your relatives, your aunts or whoever. So obviously there is some sort of a problem around oversight by other relatives, and then breakdown of your cultural norms. And then policy implication, obviously we need to focus on this side. So building community oversight also very important. Tackling social isolation and loneliness also very important. There are a couple of recommendations from my side about the areas to be studied from here. We still need more evidence around this kind of form of abuse, economic abuse. Second, we need to have some evidence around particularly institutional abuse among later life migrant population in New Zealand too. That's a very serious matter because we still need residential care, but we don't know how to actually accommodate all the needs, particular cultural issues among them in the population. Third, we need to pay more attention to transnational care or transnational abuse, because when you actually study with all the migrants here, you will find out they are actually connect with the whole original culture. They actually use WeChat all the time. They use KakaoTalk all the time. Their information comes from their own culture, not from New Zealand at all. And then how we can actually, utilize those connections, and how we can deal with their isolation from their physical connections from their own country. That's a very important issue. And still, we need to develop our understanding around their connections with local indigenous community or all other things. That's also important. I'm currently writing a book on Waipapa meet filial piety, so that we can actually have some kind of evidence around our Korean or Asian population interacting with the Maori community as a kind of connection. So we can still work on that, but other than that, this is kind of a problem we need to immediately take action to prevent some issues around that. Thank you so much. I have to finish my presentation here.
Exciting. Morena koutou. I just want to acknowledge what an absolute pleasure it is to be standing on the stage with folks that are talking about elder abuse in the real lived experience ways that our communities experience it. And I'm going to start today with an assumption, actually a couple of assumptions. The first one, I hope that we can all agree in this room that ageism is the cultural scaffolding for elder abuse. If we can't agree on that, we'll have to talk about it later. But essentially ageism, or the ideas that treat older people as less valuable than younger people, in my view, underpins why elder abuse has been left out, has been excused, and even maybe why it's been dealt with so separately to family and sexual violence. This panel is basically, in kia ora hu, is basically folks who are part of or speaking from communities of lived experience, identity and belonging, who experience discrimination before we age. That discrimination shapes who even reaches older age for us, right? We've talked about that a little bit today already, but colonisation, racism, poverty, ableism, homophobia, biphobia and transphobia all mean some of us have lower life expectancies. So discrimination means the people in the communities that we are speaking from have all had experiences of the state and all of its systems failing to value who we are, failing to treat us with dignity, failing to acknowledge our mana. In our Elder Voices research, you can see some little clips up here, we heard of widespread and ongoing experiences of discrimination in the intersection of ageing and being takatapui or rainbow. That was everyday discrimination on the street, in public places, in social services, in housing, at the doctors and aged care settings. And one impact of that discrimination was social exclusion, because our elders were being pushed further and further out into the margins. But for takatapui and rainbow older people, we're not actually just talking about the state in health and social services. The lingering impacts of Victorian British values, people have been very kind about this today, Victorian British values, embedded in our laws and institutions, means we also experience discrimination and violence in our families. Disconnection from our families of origin makes us more vulnerable to being targeted for elder abuse, and that's both because our families may not be treasuring us as we age, and because that makes us more reliant on social services that have been discriminating against us throughout our lifespan. So those Victorian British values criminalised men who love other men. Does anyone know when that happened for the first time in Aotearoa? 1858. Oh, okay, 1986. So we decolonised that act in 1986. So for the first time in 1858, men who love other men became criminals in Aotearoa. And those values, those Victorian values, continue to shape within public policy, services and the public imagination what kinds of bodies, what kinds of sex, what kinds of relationships, what kinds of families, what kinds of gender are seen as normal. If they didn't, we would not need this panel today. So to understand elder abuse, We need to consider the intersections of ageing with other lived experiences. I think everybody has talked about that today. Other belongings and identities that have been marginalised. That isn't news. I hope everyone here has already seen this quote that I've got up on the stage here. This is the United Nations release for the International Day of Older Persons last year. Their statement, and this was accompanied by 9 recommendations, highlighted the human rights challenges faced by Takatapu and Rainbow older people. They called on countries to design and implement measures to address violence and discrimination, saying, and this is awful language, when persons find themselves at the intersection of older age and being LGBT, they face a compounded situation that leads to an increased risk of heightened discrimination, social exclusion and violence. So those intersections of marginalised communities who've experienced ongoing discrimination plus ageism create some specific and unique forms of risk for elder abuse, and I think every panel member has talked about that a little bit. And what that means is we need to be really careful with how we frame our responses and policy frameworks, or we are going to unintentionally leave out people in communities who are more likely to be experiencing forms of harm we're not even recognising. I'm going to be really brutally honest and say, unfortunately, we've done that to a large extent in responding to other forms of violence. All the communities represented by this panel have had those experiences, I think, in family and sexual violence. This is not a new conversation for us to ask about what about us. The crime and victimisation survey results over the last 5 years highlight very clearly that Takatapu and Rainbow people experience more crime across our lifespans, especially interpersonal crime, but we're less likely to report that crime, and if we do ask for help, the response services don't work for us. They're not shaped for us. So when it comes to elder abuse responses, I really think we have a chance to do this a little bit differently, folks. If you only remember one thing I say today, please remember that. At the moment, most Takatapu and Rainbow older people don't share their identity in many parts of their lives. So it means when it comes to administrative data, we're not going to know. They don't feel safe enough to talk about their families, their relationships, their history, where they go on holiday, what they do on the weekend. In fact, 1 in 10 told us they don't share their identity, their authentic selves, with anybody. And that figure is higher for Māori, it's higher for Pacifica, and it's higher for ethnic Rainbow people. So how on earth, if we can't share who we are, do we expect our elders to be able to talk about elder abuse? What if their child won't let them dress or take medication that helps them express their gender? Are they going to talk about that? What if they think they have a place in an aged care facility, but it's gone at the second interview stage when they talk about being HIV positive? What if the end-of-life care service won't even let them visit their partner, even though heterosexual partners get to do that, so they don't get to watch their person pass? What if their partner has total financial control, so they no longer know what's in their bank account, but they can't even mention the fact that this is their partner to a banking service or to the police? So I guess what I want to say is we know our work with Hohou Te Rongo Kahukura is touching the very tip of the elder abuse iceberg in our communities. Those examples I've just given are real, but I could give you many, many more, none of whom are reaching out for help at the moment. Until we are accepted for all of who we are, by older person services, by healthcare professionals, by aged care services, and by wider social support systems, our elders are not going to be able to talk about our specific experiences of abuse. So for Takatapu and Rainbow older people, it is critical we make it safer for people to share all of who they are, so we can bolster up those protective factors to prevent elder abuse and stop it happening in the first place. And crucially, and this is going to be a little bit controversial because we've just seen another definition, but we need to recognise that the World Health Organisation definition of elder abuse offers something really deeply important for marginalised communities, because it says that elder abuse is not just interpersonal acts. It asks us to pay attention to policies or practices which cause harm or disregard the rights of the older person. That's important for us because it lets us take a systems approach, it lets us address discrimination, which helps us reduce risk factors. So for Takatapu and Rainbow Elder people, elder abuse is not just about ageism and ageing, it's about ageing while we are who we are, while we are Takatapu or Rainbow. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. An amazing panel again. I think some pretty clear challenges for us all to be thinking about. We have an opportunity now for some question and answers before we head off into kind of some more workshop space. So who would like to kick us off? We've got roving microphones. Oh, who? Take it away, Huhana.
Kia ora. I just want to acknowledge Paula and Debbie. I just wanted to say I am actually a survivor of violence in the Takatapui community. My ex-girlfriend beat the hell out of me and actually precipitated me going into the wheelchair in 1996. And we don't talk about it. Police, the judge, the lawyers, nobody wanted to help me. And in the end, I lost everything, and she got it all, the house, everything. I just lost everything because nobody would help represent, and to be honest, the lesbian community turned their back, and I've never, forgiven them for it. But I have a wonderful wife who accepted and embraced me for my disabilities. We're Māori. She's taught me a lot more about who I am as an adoptee. The violence and abuse I've experienced was from the age of 3, and it's compounded. I don't even know if I'm going to live to retirement age because our life expectancy is lower. And with the crisis of the health system and the fact that I am now relying more and more on it, we don't know what the future lies. But if you're poor, if you're Māori, if you're disabled, and if you are Luxon describes us as bottom feeders, we don't have many opportunities anymore left to us. We're in crisis. So I guess I just wanted to add that the compounding nature of inequalities doesn't affect us because I'm Māori. I felt that attack from day one when the coalition came in, that being Māori, I've got a win stamp on my face, all that. And then the attacks on disabled came on March 15th, and those attacks are continuing, where it's pulling people apart. We're talking about having to maybe divorce in order to be able to continue, because we can't financially manage on the budgets that they are wanting to lower them down to. It's hard because with your partner ageing as well, we need support from caregivers. It's hard because I don't have a moment alone because I need 24/7 care now. It's hard because we don't have the resources. I haven't seen my mokopuna in Australia for over 7 years. I want to go, but they will penalise me for going. It is hard to live your life as a disabled Indigenous Takatapui wahine in a world that hates you, not for one of those identities, but for every single one of them that exists. And I just wanted to add that as a construct to put together. If we're going to be defining policies in all of those, you must include the cohorts within which you are representing. So when you go with over 65 supports, don't go in there thinking we're all straight, we're all rich, we've all got a house, we're all retiring into this wonderful KiwiSaver. Some of us had to sell our KiwiSavers had to close them to get medication. Some of us have got no way of relying on anything but public transport. And that doesn't run all the time, so you're stuck at home, you're trapped. Those are the things that make it really hard, and it gets harder, and it is getting harder because of policy. Your job is to try and help mitigate some of that policy.
Kia ora, Hu. And I just want to pick up on a couple of those points too. We need to be really careful when we're thinking about communities, intersectionality, that communities themselves are diverse, that there is lateral violence within communities, and often that the seeds of that are in the struggles and the marginalisation those communities have experienced, colonisation, racism, all of the things this panel has talked about. But we need to be really careful that we don't also see communities as homogenous within themselves. So it is very multi-layered and very complex, really getting to that deep point of understanding so that we can actually think about how we might envisage a different world for older people within Aotearoa. Any questions for the panel? Yes, sorry, Sandra.
Hello?
I think that one's working.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Yes, thank you for that. One of the things that has been really pressing for Takatapu and Rainbow folks over the last 10 or 15 years is making sure that our younger people can come out into school environments that are safe for them. We have spent an awful lot of community energy on our young people, and they've needed that because they're coming out at younger ages. What we haven't seen is the same degree of attention to what's happening to people as we age. So there's this idea that all the Rainbow folks are young and white and maybe have purple hair. We don't. We're in every ethnic community in Aotearoa. We're in every place. We're in every age group. So thank you, Charlotte. I really appreciate you naming that.
Kia ora. Any other questions, reflections?
This is probably a question for Sandra. I just wanted to ask a question in terms of educating healthcare staff. So we know many older people in the residential care facility. I don't know how much training they have. You know, people come from different cultures, knowledge, history. When they provide care to older people, how do we know? How do they engage? What kind of trainings do we have in place to educate them so they can provide better care? So probably the answer is not a lot, but I'm wondering what can we do to make sure that in 20 years' time, we're not having the same conversation, sit here, repeat the same thing.
I'm not aware of there being anything to support residential staff around working with Takatapu and Rainbow older people. There used to be a program that people had to pay for. That's no longer available, called Silver Rainbow. There's a couple of things I want to say back to that. I think there's an assumption made often, and I know this won't be you, Kai, but there's an assumption made often that migrant folks working in residential aged care will be queerphobic. Actually, we know that many nurses migrate to Aotearoa from particularly Southeast Asian countries so they can be queer here. We know that because those men talk to us about what it's like to work in those places. And I guess the question really is, who are we imagining our older people are? If we're imagining that they're all straight and they're all cisgender, then we're not going to see needing to address those needs as important. We need to start actually recognising what our older communities really look like, I think. Yeah. It's not a good answer to your question, but I think it's the truth.
Following up on that, I think it's really important that we don't talk about training, that we talk about organisations restructuring so that they have policies and processes that direct people to how to respond to people in a respectful way, so that we're not getting this abuse of human rights, that people are enabled to be as autonomous and to make life choices as they age and do those things, so that that's built into the whole kaupapa of the organisation and the way that the organisational policies and practices work. Because if all we do is training, people just move, and it actually makes no difference at all. So we need, what we're doing at VisAble is we are working with organisations to upskill them to understand who disabled people are and what that means to work with disabled people and identify violence. But it's the same across all of this work that we're talking about. As Sandra says, it's a new way of understanding people and people's rights. And when I talk about ableism, it's really hard to understand the opposite of ableism. So using that wonderful 1986 or something phrase of feminism is the radical idea that women are people, I've defined anti-ableism as the radical idea that disabled people are people. And that's much the same also with the rest of us and as we age. And until I think we reach that place, we don't make change.
Kia ora. Who, did you have another comment to make? Question?
I just wanted to quickly respond and say the disabled have a saying called "nothing about us without us." It's quite simple. You engage the community that you want to have a voice for. You ask them. It's that simple. Tāne is a really good health disability network of the Asian communities here in Tamaki Makaurau, and they reach out to disability, reach out to all the different organisations to better inform their own different Asian communities. It's just important to know that, you know, it's a bit like rest homes. You know, they cater to husband and wife or single, but if you're a lesbian or you're a gay man or you're a trans couple, do they cater to that? Some of them don't even like to take to people with significant disabilities. And institutional abuse is very real in our community, not just with our seniors. I've actually managed to get a few rest homes closed down because of the abuse of seniors over the years. And I'm an ex-nurse and I recognise abuse instantly. We've got to include the very people that you represent. So if you're a senior service, who's in your service that can be your voice? Who's on your board? Who's on your trust? You've got to look at it. If they're all over 65, wonderful, but if they're all Pākehā and all male, then you're missing quite a few demographics. If you've got a mix of genders, that's fine, but if there's no trans in there or no sexuality identity in there and you want to cater to the rainbow community, you need to look at mixing it up. The Asian community is increasingly in need of support services, and we don't cater to them very well at all. Even in the disability community, I keep asking them, where are our migrant, refugee, disabled? Because I know they exist. And their voices are coming out. We've got Umi, we've got a few others are now starting to speak out more forwardly, but they can't do it unless you people that provide services actually open the door. I mean, we can push doors through. Helen Clark talks about pushing glass doors. I'm going to tell you about metal ceilings. We're punching through the metal. We haven't even broken that through yet. We can't get to the glass to break the ceilings. Rosa Parks sat on a bus and led a civil rights movement. Disabled people can't get on that bus to begin that. So unless we get support and allies on board, in the same way for Māori, same way for our Asian community, same way for our disabled, our seniors. If we collectively make an act of including people as part of our services and their voices are heard, you will have a service that's inclusive and intersectional.
Kia ora, ngā mihi. I think we are going to wrap up the Q&A there because I think that there is definitely some really important kōrero that needs to happen at your tables before we let you go for lunch. So we're going to break into workshops now.